Common sense ain't that common anymore. Seems common sense is past tense, just like the dinosaur. Political correctness has got a lot to answer for, 'cause common sense ain't that common anymore.
Now on weekends, the treasury of common sense.
Yes, the great man that is Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. It's the treasury of common sense. Hello, my friend.
G'day, Luke. How's things?
Very well. What a week you've had. I mean, this has got to be Christmas for an economist, isn't it?
Mate, I'm pretty tired, actually. I did about 13 media interviews this week.
Right.
Apple TV, flew up to Sydney, actually, mate. Did the Carl Stefanovic show.
How was that?
It was good, yeah. Carl's a ripper bloke. I met Clive Palmer as well. He's actually a ripper bloke as well. So, yeah, that was really good, but obviously pretty exhausting because I had to fly up from Melbourne and just for the day and fly home. But, yeah, certainly a massive week for me personally.
Did Carl say, hey, I listen to you speak to Luke every Saturday? Did he say that?
No.
Oh, come on, Carl.
But look, I've got to say, mate, often when you meet famous people, you sort of hope that they're the way you think they're going to be. And Carl's pretty much exactly the same as he's on the Today Show. So he doesn't put on a public persona and then act differently.
I agree.
In private.
Good man.
He's a genuinely good bloke.
So let's go to the budget. I agree with all of that. Let's go to the federal budget. This is tax reform. I know that because Dr. Jim told me, right?
Yeah, mate, it's actually more of a tax grab. So, obviously, a lot of the changes that were flagged before the budget pretty much came to fruition. So, we sort of knew what was going to happen. So, obviously, from 1 July next year, that the government's only going to allow you to negatively gear, property if it's a newly built dwelling. So, anything that's already built, you won't be able to negatively gear. People who own property before budget night will be fully grandfathered, so they can keep negative gearing. And the intent here is obviously to push investor demand away from established homes and toward new housing supply, which is fine. I'll get to why there's some issues with the stuff later. But also, they obviously, as they mentioned, that the capital gains tax system is going to change for 1 July next year. So we're going to go back to basically the pre-1999 method, whereby you get taxed on your real gains. So that's your gains in excess of inflation. And again, the gains up to 1 July next year will be measured under the old way and going forward under the new way. Now, there was a little bit of a hand grenade, which they didn't mention beforehand, and they're basically put in a minimum 30% tax on capital gains, on real capital gains. So what that is been designed for, which this is my reading of it, they basically want to hit self-funded retirees. So basically, if you're someone who's built up assets over your working life and then you retire and then you sell those assets, obviously when you're not working, you've got low marginal tax rate. They want to basically charge a 30% minimum capital gains tax on that. So that's sort of designed to squeeze more out of self-funded retirees. Now, and also, I should also mention that they've also implemented a 30% minimum tax on discretionary trusts to basically try and limit tax avoidance. So people set up trust structures, they can minimise their personal income taxes, that sort of thing. Now, my main issue with this, well, there's a few problems. So, first of all, the government claims that these changes are trying about improving housing affordability and helping out young people, etc. And taking some investor demand out of the market will put some downward pressure on prices. It should help first home buyers because they won't have to compete as hard against investors, and it should modestly increase the home ownership rate. So that's all good. But the problem with it is the budget also upgraded its net overseas migration forecast by 55,000. So this financial year, they expect 35,000 more than they expected last budget and during the December MyEFO. And next year, they expect 20,000 more migrants. So at the same time as they're saying, we're helping out first home buyers, blah, 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 we're going to level the playing field, all this sort of thing, they're importing more people, 55,000 more than they expected, who obviously need housing. And that's going to put upward pressure on rents because, migrants, when they come here, they rent. And it's going to put upward pressure on demand. At the same time as we've got rental vacancy rates at record lows, rents have soared by about 50% since the end of 2019 nationally, according to Cotality. Tenants are getting absolutely squeezed. And then that also hurts first home buyers because first home buyers typically rent before they buy. So if you're paying more in rents, it takes longer to save up a deposit. And also, obviously, higher migration also puts some upward pressure on prices. So there was one of these, giving with one hand, taking the other. But that's not my only problem with it. After these changes, Australia's going to have among the highest capital gains taxes in the world. Now, I don't really care so much that they're going to hit, people who buy established homes harder or even shares. My biggest issue is my reading is they're going to basically apply this capital gains tax regime to new businesses and venture capital. And I think that's a mistake, because the last thing Australia wants to do is discourage new businesses from starting up. And we also don't want to discourage venture capital from funding new businesses in Australia. And if obviously we make that more expensive by jacking up capital gains taxes, we're going to get less business formation in Australia. So that's one area which I think the government needs to backtrack on. And to its credit, in the budget papers, it did mention that it's going to consult on that issue. So hopefully after they consult, they'll unwind that for, new businesses and venture capital, because that's something Australia doesn't want. And my other major issue with it, Luke, is that the Treasury expects to raise billions of dollars in extra tax revenue from these types of changes, but they offered zero permanent relief for workers through personal income taxes. So Australian workers have been absolutely hammered over the last 5 or so years of this high inflation, even though our real wages have fallen by about 6%.
Are we talking here about bracket creep?
Yes, we are. Right. So basically, Australian workers have gone backwards. So our earnings haven't kept up with inflation the last several years. Where our real wages are about 6% below their peak. But because we've had this nominal wage growth, so that's your wage growth that hasn't kept up with inflation, but your wages have gone up, we've been pushed into higher tax brackets, and we're actually paying more tax. And according to the federal budget, personal income taxes account for 52% of the total tax take, and the federal budget actually forecasts that personal income taxes are going to keep rising over the next few years, and they're going to actually account for 54.5% of the federal government taxes by 2030. Now that, and the federal budget actually upgraded the personal income tax take by $15 billion versus December last year. So we've got a government which is basically squeezing us harder every year. We're paying more and more tax every year because of inflation, yet our wages aren't keeping up with inflation, so we're going backwards. Yet they're squeezing us harder and harder for tax. Now, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the median full-time salary in Australia, or earnings, is about $100,000.
Right.
And the top marginal tax rate here kicks in at $190,000. So you only have to earn 1.9 times the median full-time earnings to pay the top marginal tax rate. And that's an absurdly low figure. That's amongst the lowest in the world. And according to the federal budget's own forecast of wage growth, by mid-2028, the median full-time earnings in Australia is going to rise to $108,500. And by that time, if they don't adjust these scales, you'll only have to earn 1.75 times that, the median full-time earnings, to pay the top marginal tax rate. So this is a major problem here. It's insane. So Australians are going to keep getting gouged as long as they don't adjust these tax scales. And here's the thing that sucks about it, Luke. They adjust fuel excise, petrol excise, fuel excise, tobacco excise. All sorts of excises get adjusted up every year by inflation, but they don't adjust the tax scales by inflation.
Yeah.
And this is my biggest problem with this budget. It's a tax grab, it's not tax reform, because they've closed all these so-called loopholes to raise extra tax, but then they haven't used that money to then give relief to wage and salary earners who continue to pay more and more tax every year simply because of inflation, because of bracket creep, even though their real wages are falling.
Well, mate, and then they say, we'll throw you a couple of $100 this year, and then we'll throw you another couple of $100 next year, and they think they've got everyone's back. But those figures on that chart, they're stunning. So in the current year, you've got to earn 1.94 times average earnings to be at the top rate, and you've only got to go forward 5 years. 1.94 becomes 1.7 becomes 1.6. That is. I heard someone through the week in politics say they're taxing inflation. And now that makes a bit of sense to me. They're laughing all the way to the bank, aren't they?
Yeah. So the personal income taxes are designed to basically grow every year, without the government doing anything, just by inflation. So it's the single biggest earner for the government, and it's the fastest growing component of tax revenue for the government. And they can simply do nothing and just let inflation push us all up into higher tax brackets, even though we're going backwards once you adjust for inflation. We're not earning enough to keep up with inflation, yet we get taxed harder and harder every year.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest issue with this budget. They've raised all this extra tax by closing the loopholes or so-called loopholes and negative gearing, capital gains taxes, trusts, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But they haven't then used the extra money they're getting to index the marginal tax scales to inflation so that we don't get this continual bracket creep.
Yeah.
Because in the end, the government can do nothing, just raise all these extra billions and then just waste our money.
Yeah,
and
exactly right.
As long as we have this process in place whereby they do nothing and their tax revenue goes up every year because of inflation, that's just more money for them to waste. And it basically instills poor discipline on spending.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest issue with this budget.
All right, let's do this now. And that would be to announce a clown of the week. Wow, what a surprise. Who have you found?
Yeah, look, it's actually Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, or the Albanese government, I should say. So just in the lead up to the budget, they cancelled the Inland Rail project. So the Inland Rail project was basically a big rail freight project between Melbourne and Brisbane. It was designed to basically improve the efficiency of freight so that we can actually export things in this country, things that get produced in the regions, which is where most of the nation's wealth comes from. But they were going to improve the railway line between Melbourne and Brisbane. Now the project obviously the project wasn't perfect, and it was forecast to cost about $45 billion and be completed by basically in a decade's time, which is below, which is taken longer than they expected. And the government basically cancelled it because they said, it's too expensive, right? Now that on its own you might go, okay, fair enough. But at the same time, the Albanese government has instead committed billions of dollars to Melbourne's suburban rail loop, right? So they've basically cancelled an inland rail project which would help regional Australia and make us more export competitive for the suburban rail loop in Melbourne, which is the biggest boondoggle project I've ever seen. Like, pretty much nobody thinks this project is a good idea. It's failed every cost-benefit analysis, right? And, former Premier Jeff Kennett in Melbourne, who was Melbourne's Victoria's last good premier, called the suburban rail loop the greatest white elephant of any public project in Victoria's history, which it is. So my issue with this is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has completely screwed over the regions, and he's cancelled a project which would help the regions in order to channel that money instead to bail out his incompetent Victorian government, which has been an absolute clown show, and in order to pander to inner city voters in Melbourne with a rail line that makes absolutely no sense economically or socially, and most Melburnians don't actually support it. We think it's a joke, right? Purely to bail out his Victorian mates or his Victorian, Allen government. And in doing so, he's completely screwed over the regions. And I think this is poor. Right, absolutely poor. And once again, Australia's regions have been absolutely ripped off. And ultimately, taxpayers in New South Wales and Queensland, who are obviously listening to this show, you are going to be spending some of your hard-earned money to fund a ridiculous project in Melbourne, which should never have been undertaken in the first place. And you're going to do it to basically bail out the Victorian government, which is an absolute incompetent mess.
Wow. Great stuff, mate. Have a terrific weekend. I'll talk to you in a week's time.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Thank you. Leith Van Onselen, macrobusiness.com.au. That's a really strong point he made in relation to that rail funding. I mean, and the Victorian election is in November, and he's doing everything he can to, I don't want to say deck chairs and Titanic in the same sentence, but it kind of, anyway.